All right. Good morning. So, Parshas Achrei and Parshas Kedoshim, double Parsha again. And we're, as we said, catching ourselves up, more Parshios than there are weeks, especially when Yom Tovim fall out on weekends, and it's not a leap year, so we are, again, in our double Parsha Achrei Kedoshim. It's not, again, overly long, two Parshios that are under average in length get combined together to equal, so I cannot remember the exact total number, and my computer's flashing and blinking, so somewhere around the 140, 150 pasuk range again, so average size once they're combined together. And so the structure of the double Parshios is not always balanced in the sense that there's sometimes three aliyahs all combined into one. This Parsha is unique in that it is very balanced, in that there's Rishon is the first two aliyahs, Sheni is the third and fourth aliyahs, and then we bridge over from one Parsha to the next in Revi'i, the last aliyah, the beginning of the next one, so it is even, so that there's two aliyahs in every aliyah, so it's a nice kind of even balance. Parshas Achrei also goes through several different themes, so we'll start off with the first one. The Parsha starts off with Achrei Shnei Bnei Aaron, after the death of Aaron's two sons, and we discussed the death of Aaron's two sons, which occurred in the Parsha of a couple of weeks ago. We were struggling to figure out what some of the reasons why Aaron's sons should have died, and one of the explanations why Aaron's sons died is because they entered the Kedoshim without permission, and the reason why that is suggested as a potential answer is that this week's Parsha, which continues on Achrei after the death of Aaron's two sons, goes into the special service of Yom Kippur, and that the Kohen Gadol would enter and do special offerings inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur. And so what's the connection between the death of Aaron's sons and this? Potentially that the Aveira that Aaron's sons did was that they were overstepping the limits of what is appropriate for them, and they were pushing towards a level of Kedusha and closeness to Hashem, which was inappropriate even for them, and they were entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim without permission, and so therefore the Parsha connects Achrei Shnei Bnei Aaron, the two sons of Aaron died, and then we go into the service of Yom Kippur. We had a whole Parsha in between, Tazria Mitzorah, that we had last week, but it's also good to note that by continuing a Parsha with Achrei Shnei Bnei Aaron, that no time has passed since 2 weeks ago Parsha, right? The Parsha of 2 weeks ago was during the Yemei Miluim, the end of the days of the Mishkan being put up, and we were on the 1st of Nisan during that second year in the desert, and then we had this whole Torah portion of last week where we learned all these rules of tsaras and all the rules of a woman who gives birth, and the rules of kashrus, but nothing, like there's no events that took place in last week's Parsha, if you think about it, where no time really goes by. So we pick up the story, continuing on. Aaron gets the commandment, now that he's the Kohen Gadol, right after his sons died in the on the first day that the Mishkan was put up on the 1st of Nisan, the second year. We just continue right on into the story, and Aaron is told these mitzvos of the Yom Kippur Avoda. So the Yom Kippur Avoda has some significant parts to it. We are told specifically in this section about the special service that relates to a special bull that's being brought, and a goat that's being brought in a very unique way. All the korbanos, when we had learned about the korban chatas, the sin offerings, when we had learned them at the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, their service was, generally speaking, the offering is slaughtered, the blood is caught, the blood is brought to the mizbeach, to the altar, they sprinkle the blood onto the corners of the altar, and then after the animal is cut into sections, most of the offering, most of the animal is burnt on the mizbeach, and pieces of the rest of the offering are given to the kohanim to eat, and that is the general way. When we see korban chatos, a sin offering, it's generally done in that way. What the animal is can be specific to the aveira, but that's the overall process of a korban chatos. We have these two sin offerings that are brought here, which are very unique and very different, in that the blood, after the offering is brought, the blood is taken and placed in a special container, and the Kohen is going to wear special garments, these white garments that he wears only on Yom Kippur, and he takes the blood from these offerings and he brings it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. Now the process that we're told about in this week's Parsha is that first he has a Ketoris offering. First he sacrifices. Actually, we're told in Musaf that the order basically is that he slaughters the bull offering, and then after he catches the blood, he leaves the blood there. Then he goes and he grabs some coals from the mizbeach, and he gets two handfuls of ketores, and he brings the handfuls of ketores and the coals into the Kodesh HaKadosh, the Holy of Holies, where he puts them between the stake. Remember, the poles of the Aron never came out, so the poles are resting. The Aron is resting in the Kodesh HaKadosh with the poles in it. He stands between the poles and he puts the coals onto the ground there, and he burns the incense in there, and the cloud of smoke goes up. And then he comes back outside and he slaughters a goat offering, and now he has these two. Well, before he slaughters the goat, he takes the blood of the bull offering and he brings the blood of the bull offering into the Holy of Holies, sprinkles the blood in a special way, once upwards and then 7 times downwards, and then he goes outside of the Holy of Holies and he sprinkles it again inside the Beis Hamikdash towards the Parochas, and then he pours the blood of that offering onto the inside Mizbeach, which normally doesn't serve as a blood offering location, and so it's a very unique type of offering because we call it the chatas bifnim, an internal chatas, because it's brought inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim and inside the Beis Hamikdash. All the other korbanos are always brought outside, so they bring that bull offering, and then there's another goat offering, and then that goat offering is handled in a similar way. The blood is taken, brought inside, sprinkled on the inside in the same way as the bull was. Then the two bloods are combined together, and then the bloods are sprinkled together. So a total of 3 sets of sprinklings on this blood service as part of the Yom Kippur service. While all of this Yom Kippur service is going on, the Kohen the Kohen Gadol on the day of Yom Kippur has to perform all the regular services as well. So the process that we see, without going into it in great detail, in the Musaf of Yom Kippur, tells us that essentially whenever he would do the regular daily services, he'd have to wear the regular Kohen garments that we had learned about, the 8 Kohen garments. Whenever he would be doing one of the offerings that's listed in this week's Parsha, that are special Yom Kippur offerings, he have to change into special Yom Kippur garments, which essentially are 4 garments. They look like the regular Kohen garments, and they are all white. And every time he would switch, he would wash his hands and feet, and then he would go to the mikvah, come out, wash his hands and feet, and then go switch over to the service of the Yom Kippur. Then he would go back in, wash his hands and feet, go to the mikvah, come out, wash his hands and feet, and change back into the regular Kohen Gadol garments. Go inside the Beis Hamikdash again, do things like light the menorah, and then burn the regular daily offerings, and then come back out again, and then change into his Yom Kippur clothing again to continue Yom Kippur service. And he switched back and forth during the day 5 times. So it was a lot of back and forth, a lot of changing. Another very interesting set of korbanos, a set of animals that are brought in the beginning of this week's parsha, is the 2 goats, which are like twins. They're both the same, and there's a lottery, and they're both taken together, and one is pronounced La Hashem, one is pronounced La Azazel. One is supposed to one is for Hashem. Actually, the goat that we have been discussing, that the blood was sprinkled on the inside, was selected in that way. So the one that was selected for Hashem was the one that was slaughtered, and its blood sprinkled on the inside of the Beis Hamikdash. The one that was designated La Azazel was sent away into the desert. What's the purpose of all of these offerings? So the Gemara tells us that the offerings that were for the goat offering that was offered on the inside was specifically to atone for averos relating to people being impure going into the Beis Hamikdash with their state of impurity, or if they were impure and they eat sacrifices in a state of impurity. So then the bull offering was specifically for Kohanim and for Aaron himself, the Kohen Gadol himself, who may have also had averos of that type. And the Azazel, that's the key. That's the most important main offering of the Yom Kippur. The Azazel offering, that's the one that gets the atonement for all of the other averos that Klal Yisrael have. And the process for that Azazel is that they would take that goat and they would send it out into the desert, and they would tie a crimson thread around the horns of the goat, push it off a cliff, and if Bnei Yisrael, they would tie the other side of the, another red string over the opening of the Beis Hamikdash, and if the atonement was achieved, the thread would turn white. And so that was a significant moment of the Yom Kippur service, with everybody around, Bnei Yisrael all crowding around by the Beis Hamikdash, waiting, observing, watching the Kohen do all of this service, and then observing and seeing the red thread turn white was a monumental moment in the service and was significant, important. There were a few points in the service that were monumental and very important. This idea of the Kohen Gadol going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim was apparently a very scary moment, because a Kohen who was unworthy wouldn't make it out alive. And we're told, and the Gemara tells us about, during the second Beis HaMikdash era, there were a lot of Kohanim who were not worthy. It became a political appointment over the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. We always think of the Kohen Gadol being very holy people, and during the second Beis HaMikdash, there were more. There was basically average a Kohen a year, right? They had one Kohen who lasted, the Shimon HaTzadik, who was the Kohen for the first 40 years of the second Beis HaMikdash period, then after that, the position of Kohen Gadol was a political appointed position. People would pay in order to have their family members installed as the Kohen Gadol. And it's an interesting thing, and this I haven't quite all fathomed and figured out, because they used to tie a string around the Kohen Gadol as he would walk into the Kodesh HaKodashim, so that if he would go in and he was unworthy, then when he would drop dead, they would be able to pull him out. So I'm not quite sure why you would pay in order to be able to get that. I suppose that there's a certain level of hubris that you have to achieve, where you think that you're so important that I'm going to pay after the last 40 Kohanim Gedolim didn't make it, but I'm gonna be fine because I'm awesome. So I guess if you have that level of confidence in your abilities, that I guess you have to really be on a very low level to have that level of confidence and not be aware of it. Yeah.
Were there moments where the string didn't turn white?
Yes. So after then we, that leading up to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, right at the end of the times, the red string stopped turning white, and so it was a concerning moment. And it meant that Hashem didn't forgive the Jewish people for all of their averos. So there wasn't much else to do, right? You do everything that you can, but I guess the problem is that everybody wasn't doing everything that they should do, which is that all of these services and everything that's being brought in this week's parsha as the avoda, the service of Yom Kippur, only can go so far. Ultimately, these are processes and procedures, but the main thing is supposed to be the change in heart that we have, and the atonement and the tshuva that we do. And without the tshuva, the internal tshuva that we do, all these processes and korbanos aren't going to have their full desired effect. Now, having said that, the Gemara does say that Yom Kippur itself is mechaper, the day itself does atone, and so even, it changes averos that we have that are intentional to unintentional, and unintentional sins to accidental sins, and wipes away accidental sins. So it does, definitely Yom Kippur in any event is going to decrease the level of responsibility we have. But if we don't do tshuva, while our punishment may be degraded, it won't be completely eliminated. So therefore, what we hope is to have our intentional sins degraded to unintentional sins, so that we can then say, well, since it was unintentional, we really regret it and we don't mean it, and then Hashem can forgive us for those unintentional sins that were originally intentional. So that's the plan, and that's how Yom Kippur works. And that's how the first aliyah of Achrei starts, but it continues on into Levi of, yes.
I know we're trying to move along.
It's okay, but yes.
The whole approach to throwing the sheep or the goat over the cliff seems to go like, it's a very different approach from how we generally shaft animals and whatnot. We always say how we're so sensitive and we do it in the most humane way, and this just seems like we're throwing an animal over. Are there discussions about how it's not?
No, I've never seen anybody discussing that this is the Tsar Balei Chayim issue, which is that generally speaking, we're very, very cautious in treating all of things in creation with respect. Mm-hmm. And then there are circumstances where we seem to be very destructive, right? And so the answer is everything has purpose, right? Everything that even a destructive action or harmful action has its own purpose. And I suppose in whatever way and capacity, the violent death of this goat, which represents the casting away of averos, has to be done in this sort of a way in order for the atonement to be achieved. We are really more concerned about wasteful or unnecessary harm than we are that everything that we do shouldn't have any difficult consequences. And I suppose, if you're looking the broader metaphysical way of looking at the world, Hashem runs the world in that way as well. He doesn't spare us all pain and all suffering. He puts us in situations where pain and suffering are designed in order to help build us and grow us towards higher levels, and for ultimately there's a purpose, a hashgacha pratis, a specific plan that Hashem has that brings us forward. Unnecessary suffering Hashem removes, but he doesn't remove all suffering. And so therefore the idea that no animal should ever have any pain or suffering as a result of a sacrifice or things, that isn't necessarily the intention of the goal, but that everything that should happen should be for purpose and by design. That's a good, I guess, a good way of looking at the world. The world is created, after all, with the purpose of this, not to get too far afield. Like I said, I don't want to try to get too far afield in the Parshas here, but the idea, right, what Hashem could have not bothered to create the world and just given everybody all the reward that he wants to give us. But we have this concept of Nama de Kisufa, which is that Hashem does not, if Hashem were to give us undeserved reward, we wouldn't be able to accept it. It would be embarrassing for us. It would be difficult for us to be able to accept something that is not earned. So therefore Hashem puts us in circumstances where we have to earn what it is that we have, so that we can be able to accept the gifts and things that Hashem wants to offer us. So Hashem sets up the world in this way, but it's a good demonstration to us that everything that exists in the world doesn't come without cause, effect, consequence, pain, suffering, comes in order to be able to relieve and for long-term gain. That's my sort of the way I look at it. Okay, so the Levi Aliyah continues on and continues into the Yom Kippur service, which we went through. The mitzvah, the first mitzvah of this parsha, and there are, actually many mitzvahs in this week's parsha. I should mention them as we go along through them, right? The prohibition against Kohanim going into the Beis HaMikdash without any purpose, right? You can't go in unless you have service to perform. You can't just take a walk and just check out the Beis HaMikdash. So going into the Beis HaMikdash without a purpose is a lo saseh. The avoda, the Yom Kippur avoda, is one single mitzvah, right? The mitzvah of the Yom Kippur avoda is one mitzvah, and the prohibition, we are told, of that you're not allowed to bring a korban outside the Beis HaMikdash. So if once the Beis HaMikdash, and that wasn't always that way, because you find throughout the Chumash, korbanos being brought by avos all over the place. Once the place of the Mikdash was established, then the rule kicks in that we're not allowed to have personal or private places of sacrifice. Interestingly, the requirement to the possibility of bringing sacrifices isn't actually dependent on having a Beis HaMikdash. It's dependent on it being in the appropriate and right place. And so therefore, the reason why some sacrifices we don't bring nowadays, like we could theoretically bring a Korban Pesach, the reason we don't is because we don't know the actual location of the Mizbeach, right? Not necessarily just because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So because the actual location of the of things, the precise location of things is unknown, and so therefore we don't bring korbanos in of those types, but we can't bring these korbanos outside the Beis HaMikdash either, for the lo saseh that's in this week's parsha, that you're not allowed to bring a korban outside the Beis HaMikdash. And interestingly, we also have corresponding, you're not allowed to bring something that's not a sacrifice inside the Beis HaMikdash. So things that are outside belong outside, things that are inside belong inside, and you should not take something inside outside and outside inside. Okay, into Shlishi we go. We are introduced to an interesting mitzvah called Kisui Hadam. Kisui Hadam is when somebody slaughters a bird or a non-domesticated kosher animal. Right? We divide the animal types into two main types. Domesticated are the animals that they go out to pasture, but they come home at night, like cows and sheep and goats. I'm told, I don't have one, but they don't. They go out. They apparently come back. They like to live near the house for protection purposes and in their flocks and things. And then you have animals like deer and gazelle and those types that live in the wild for months at a time and don't need humans and aren't interested in the interaction with humans all that much for their upkeep and care. Those are called chayos in the Torah. The word for those are called chayos. Chayos have a different rule. When you do shechita, when you're slaughtering on those animals, then the blood that comes out has to be covered by dirt. So you can do it indoors. Or if you do let's say somebody has a slaughterhouse and they have deer that they're slaughtering, but you need to have dirt that you cover the blood with. And the same thing with poultry. When you're slaughtering birds, you need to have dirt that you put on top. Yes, so that's interesting, right? On top of the blood. On top of the blood that comes off, correct.
So you see roadkill, is that like, because this is an actual deed?
So roadkill is under the category of something called nevela. Nevela is non-properly slaughtered meat, right? So that has its own rules to it. This is going to be properly slaughtered meat. So this is going to be kosher venison, right? You're going to go serve it in a fancy restaurant and things. But the people who are doing the shechita have to do this mitzvah of kisui hadam. Sorry?
Is there a reason why we're differentiating these types of animals for this halacha?
I'm sure there are great reasons. I don't know.
Yeah, like why not domesticated animals? Surely their blood is equivalent.
Yeah, let me put me on research. I'm going to go do some research. Somebody's got to jot these things down so that I actually do the research and come to next week's parsha and actually answer some of these questions, because sometimes we get the good questions and they don't come back with the answers. So.
They're domesticated. They're somewhat obedient to some degree.
And so therefore their blood in some kind of a way is already
It's not as wild or something.
has to return to the earth in some way. It seems like that's the right track. So I'm going to see if anybody talks about it and see if we can't find something. I don't have a great answer for why. I'm always scared of the why questions on the chukim, because I have to admit I don't know. It's tough.
If they're cooking, then how would you even find an answer?
Because I find that the more something has no explanation, the more people try to give an explanation. That's a great thing about Mefarshim. That's correct. The more Mefarshim, there's lots of Mefarshim love the things that you can't explain, because then it gives you opportunities for creativity.
Aren't you really not supposed to be doing that?
But you're not supposed to be saying this is the definitive reason, because you don't want to say the reason I do this mitzvah is because of this explanation. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn something from the mitzvah in any event, right?
Well, yeah, they talk about like with kashrus of
you don't want to say that kashrus is healthy, that's why I eat it, right?
Right.
It's not, or that's
say,
this type of slaughter is best because it's least painful for the animals. Because then I would say, well, then what if I can do I can kill the animals after doing anesthetic? Is that now anesthetize all the animals before we do shechita? No, that's not kashrus, and the ultimate objective is not the pain to diminish the pain and suffering of animals. It may actually be that the shechita is a great process of killing animals humanely, but that isn't the reason, right? So we can say that that's also a lesson that we can learn to be humane to animals, but it's not the reason. So whatever reason I give is not going to be the reason. Could be a reason. So I'll look something up. The next part of, really towards the end of Achrei, the beginning of Achrei is the Torah reading for Yom Kippur. Obviously, it makes sense because it's the service of Yom Kippur. The end of Parshas of Achrei also is read on Yom Kippur at Mincha time, and it is the inappropriate relationships, the people who are not allowed to get married. A man's not allowed to marry his daughter. He can't marry his father's wife. All of these kinds of relationships is a list in Shlishi of this week's Parsha, and we're told that you get kares, which is this punishment, which is varying explanations, and it could be a combination of all of them or either one of them, that you live out half your lifespan, right? So we, generally speaking, have people who are that have received kares. The Gemara describes them like 70 years an average lifespan, so therefore people who die at 33, 34 years old. The Gemara will talk about people like Achitofel or some of these people who received kares dying at a younger age as a result of it, or somebody will not have children, or else somebody loses shares in Olam Haba as a result of averos that are kares. So they're significant and important. If you do these averos on purpose, you get kares. If you do these averos through negligence, you're unaware, so then you would bring a korban. So you bring a korban chatas for these averos. The Torah tells us that you're not supposed to follow the ways of the Egyptians and the Canaanim. Apparently they were steeped in these immoral type relationships, and so we're told to stay away from them. And there's a correlation between keeping our purity in these regards and our relationship with the land of Eretz Yisrael. We have to be able to keep our morality, that we are entitled to be a nation and to live in Eretz Yisrael because we are keeping a level of morality that justifies our right to be in a holy place like Eretz Yisrael. We're told about the requirement of v'chai bahem. A lot of great moments in this parsha, individual psukim that are very famous. V'chai bahem is the pasuk that tells us that pikuach nefesh, life always overrides anything in the Torah. So therefore, if we ever wind up in a circumstance where a life and death requires us to violate a commandment, we are always told, with 3 exceptions, to always live and break the law, right? The exceptions would be if somebody's being forced to commit a adulterous act, murder, or worship idols, right? Those are the big 3 that we are supposed to die instead of performing those averos, as they represent the most essential pieces of our faith, and therefore there would be no point in continuing to live if we didn't uphold those elements. But generally otherwise, right, somebody gets hurt on Shabbos, you call the ambulance, and we are, as the question was once asked, I cannot remember who it was, which the Shiloh was asked to, but in any event, the Shiloh was once asked to a Rav, if you are, whether in a certain circumstance where you have a injury, should I call an ambulance, should I not call an ambulance? And he said, you should definitely call an ambulance. He said, well, aren't you being very lenient on the laws of Shabbos? He says, no, I'm being very strict on the laws of the Chai Bahem, right? So it's not, one shouldn't always look at things as, oh no, I'm worried about my stringencies and am I being very lenient? There's always the yin and yang of these sorts of mitzvos, and the Chai Bahem is considered to be a highest level. The whole detailed list of arayos, every one of those prohibited relationships represents a separate negative commandment. So on our list of negative commandments, numbers 188 to 208 are taken care of through all the list of all the people that you're not allowed to marry, sisters, aunts, all of those people that you're not allowed to marry. So those are all included in there. We move into the 4th aliyah, and we continue on with arayos by telling us the prohibition against homosexuality relationships and relations with animals, one for males and one for females. So that's mitzvos 209, 210, and 211. Then we go into the new parsha, Parshas Kedoshim, and we have the very interesting pasuk of the command of Kedoshim to you should be holy. And it is not counted as one of the mitzvos, even though it sounds like it's a mitzvah, because the Rambam doesn't count mitzvos that are inclusive, are general mitzvos, meaning there's no specific action one needs to take as part of being holy. That sounds like that's just a general way of being. Now, if you tell somebody, hey, you should be holy, what does it take to be holy? What does it mean to be a holy person? So, many Meforshim try to address this issue, what holiness means. And the Ramban famously tells us being holy means being separate and distinct, right? That means that we should not consider ourselves just another member of the global community, but we have an obligation to separate ourselves and make ourselves distinct as a nation and set ourselves aside for the purpose of serving Hashem. And Kedoshim to you, the idea of being Kodesh means to make a separation, as we have, for example, by our Havdalah, we have Kodesh and we have Chol, we have things that are general and then we have things that are holy. And those two things are supposed to remain separated and distinct. So when we're told Kedoshim to you, we should make ourselves separate and distinct through the performance of the mitzvos. So then we are told mitzvos of having reverence of our parents. And interestingly, when we are told that we're supposed to fear our parents in this week's parsha, it says that you should fear your parents and keep the Shabbos. And the Mefarshim want to know what's the connection between fearing Shabbos and between honoring our parents and fearing and keeping Shabbos. And the Mefarshim explain that if your parents tell you to do a mitzvah against the Torah, like for example, they tell you to violate Shabbos, you have to keep the Torah first, because your parents have an obligation to keep the Torah as well. So therefore, that's the connection, right? We always have to honor our parents, but if our parents tell us to do something that's against the Torah takes priority over the honoring of the parents. That's mitzvah number 212, to fear our parents. The prohibitions against idolatry, 213, 214, and the proper protocol for korbanos that is in this, that is in the parsha, which is in Revi. Okay, so then we continue on into agricultural mitzvos. The mitzvos of Peah and Leket, which are when you grow a field, so you're supposed to not harvest the corner of your crops. And Leket, if you have there are 3 types of things. Shechicha is not in this week's parsha, but Leket is. Shechicha is when I forget to harvest something, and then I should not go back and harvest something that I skipped. Leket is the things that fall. When I'm collecting, I shouldn't pen down and pick them up, leave those for the poor people as well. And so in that way, we sort of have an opportunity for poor people to be fed in society. Those rules are given for fields, for wheat fields, and then they are duplicated again for vineyards. So we have mitzvahs 216 to 219 and then 220 to 223. We're told we're not allowed to steal things. We're not allowed to lie or swear falsely. You're not allowed to, interestingly, also in that category, also delaying wages. And this is a very important mitzvah that sometimes people do not realize that it is a los aseh, that if you owe somebody wages because they worked for you, you have to pay them on time. So if you have somebody who comes over and cleans your house, and you can't say, well, I'll pay you next week for both this week and next week. If you have somebody who comes over, you got to pay them on time. Yeah.
Do you have to pay them for Shkia?
Shkia is usually your deadline. If you do the work today, then you have to be able to pay them today, right?
So like in the winter when Shkia is at 4:30.
Yeah. Now everything is dependent on the employment contract, because this is where you wind up set.
They're fine being paid
Exactly.
Sunday for
Correct.
working Saturday.
If I've got a nanny, right, and my nanny does the work today, and I usually pay her at the end of the day before she leaves, and now I've got a shkia problem because she's a daily worker, and today shkia is going to be 4:30, and she's leaving, and she's going to leave at 5, which means she's not getting her pay until 5 o'clock. But meanwhile, I owe her for all the hours up until 4:30. That could be problematic unless you tell her, right? Yeah. Now it's not this mitzvah specifically applies to Jewish people, but we always we try to apply our mitzvahs to non-Jews as well, in the sense where the keeping our peace and our good relations with our non-Jewish people is in the same sort of a category of things that we have to do. But there's nothing wrong with specifying you get paid today at the end of the day at 5 o'clock when you leave, and that's okay. I could, for example, have an employment agreement with my teachers that I pay them on a monthly basis, right? So I don't have to pay everybody on a day-by-day basis. This is how much you made today, right? As long as it's the agreement, then we're okay. But you have to be able to make sure that it's clear in the agreement, because the default agreement is, if you work today, you get paid today, right? It's not, if you work today, you'll work 3 or 4 times and I'll pay you all together at once at the end of the week, unless you specify that. So that's important. Then we're told that you're not allowed to curse deaf people specifically, right? Because you're not allowed to give curses to any Jewish people, but cursing the deaf is problematic, and you'd think, well, they don't know anyway, what's the difference? And so we're told that's an avera, that's something specific to do. And then we have a very interesting mitzvah of lifnei iver lo sitei michshol, this week's parsha, which is don't put a stumbling block before a blind person, which is an interesting highlighted mitzvah as being the only mitzvah that doesn't mean what it says, right? If you actually take a stumbling block and put it in front of a blind person, you're liable for damages for hurting the person, but you haven't violated the prohibition of putting a stumbling block before a blind person. Putting a stumbling block before a blind person is a metaphorical mitzvah of tricking somebody into doing something, misleading them on false pretenses. That's the idea. So if I tell somebody that they're going to get a great deal if they go to such and such a supermarket, because you intend to go to the other supermarket and pick up the item that you don't want them to take it before you get there, that's your problem of lifnei iver. There are many ways to violate prohibitions of lifnei iver, but the literal way of putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person doesn't violate the prohibition of lifnei iver. So it's an interesting mitzvah in that regard. We move on to the 5th aliyah chamishi. A judge is told that you might think that you have poor people and rich people who come into your courtroom, you should take care of poor people, right? The rich people can afford it. The answer is no. You can't take a look and say that just because you have a poor person and a corporation that we may as well just, let's give this poor person a couple of $1,000s, the corporation won't even miss it. You always have to look at justice as justice. So you can't even favor the poor people over the rich people, and for sure not the other way around. We are told about avoiding gossip. Lo selech rachil b'amecha, another wonderful pasuk in this week's parsha. You can't go bear tales in your people. And somebody said, well, what if they're true? Then if it's true, then it becomes lashon hara. If it's not true, then you're in violation of this lo selech rachil b'amecha. You're not allowed to bear tales and tell stories. You can't hate people, and you have to tell people when they're doing the wrong thing. Interestingly, right, then that you're not allowed to have any grudges, no revenge, lo sikom, velo titor, no grudges, no revenge, and you have to love your neighbors in this week's parsha. These are great mitzvos that are in this section. The Chavetz Chaim, of course, writes a whole sefer on lashon hara, and you won't find one specific mitzvah of lashon hara, and that's the point of the Chavetz Chaim sefer, is that speaking lashon hara winds up being a combination of many averos. And so we often think of things like, well, when we see a prohibition of something, so it's prohibited in the Torah. Sometimes one specific thing that we do could be a violation of many averos simultaneously, right? So, for example, if I cook a bunch of ants with milk, I could be in violation of meat and milk at the same, or actually the Gemara's example is if I cook gid hanasha, if I take a animal, I can't eat the gid hanasha of the animal, the what's the name of that, the sciatic nerve, whatever, the sinews, right, from the animal. If I cook that together in milk, so I can be in violation of cooking meat and milk and also eating the gid hanasha, and I can violate multiple things with one action. So too, when I speak lashon hara, I can be in violation of speaking badly about people, harming other people financially. I could be a violation of hating them in my heart. I could be in many different things in violation, and that's the point of the Sefer of Chafetz Chaim, is that speaking lashon hara is not just one simple thing. It is potentially encompasses many things. Important to note is that you have the mitzvah of hocheach tochichas misecha, that you have to rebuke people. You can't let people just go about doing the wrong things, but it also is tied together with don't embarrass people, right? You can't rebuke people and embarrass them simultaneously. So if you're in a circumstance where if you tell them that they're doing the wrong thing, that will embarrass them, then don't, right? Those two things are connected. If you can tell somebody they're doing the wrong thing without embarrassing them, then that's a good thing. But if you can't, then don't. And there is, again, I can't remember, these things pop in my mind, but I can't remember exactly. I have to Google them and find where the sources and things are. That the mitzvah of hochech tochiach hasamisecha is not that we don't apply it nowadays because we're just not good at being able to tell people in a nice way and not embarrass them. So if you feel like you have a relationship with somebody, or somebody really, really wants to know, I always say, like, for example, if I'm in davening and I see somebody's tefillin is off center, and I know that they want to be wearing tefillin and they want it to be in center, and they're not going to be embarrassed if I hand them a mirror, so then that's an opportunity for me to tell them that they're not doing the mitzvah properly, and that'll be fine. But if I, want to embarrass people, then I can't. There are circumstances, like, for example, the Gemara says very specifically that there is a prohibition against making music on Shabbos, and so if you see somebody who's banging on a table or clapping hands, it may wind up being a violation of making music on Shabbos. But nobody should tell anybody who's doing that, right? The Gemara specifically says don't tell them not to. Why? Because they're going to do it anyway, and if they're going to do it anyway, so then you're going to embarrass them, and then there's going to be worse for them to know it's the wrong thing to do, and they're going to do it anyway. So therefore, better not to tell anybody those kinds of things. So
singing, just be making music also.
So singing is not, because singing is not a musical, there's no instrument involved. So it's a rabbinic, the prohibition against playing musical instruments is rabbinic because musical instruments break and then they need to get repaired. Like, for example, I have my guitar and my string breaks, so I have to fix it. Fixing a guitar is a d'oraisa. Playing a guitar is d'rabbanan, is only rabbinic. So therefore, when we add on, anytime you use, let's say, I take my my fork and I start banging on the table, so that is included in that category. This is something that anybody can look up in their Shmir Shabbos afterwards and things, but it would be a good for example of something which is only rabbinically implied, and you don't want to tell people to not do something that they're going to do anyway, and then they become rebellious, and then their avera is even worse.
Is there a difference if you say it not in the moment, but like
probably better if you say it not in the moment? People are less embarrassed.
For the fact,
yeah.
Like, at a totally different time, if you do like, hey, did you know?
It's a great thing to come up in Shabbos here, not at your Shabbos table.
Because
right?
you said that they're going to do it anyway, but what if it's like?
Yes. I always say another great example is you see somebody is walking with their baby carriage and you know the Erev is down, right? Right. Right. You're not supposed to tell the person exactly, because what are they going to do?
What are you going to do now? Now they have no.
Correct. So that happened
It
this year.
was wrong.
Yeah, it was wrong. It was all wrong. But we saw people, and I was like, "What are we supposed to do?" And it's like, they're not leaving their baby in the middle of the park.
Right. So you can't. So you have to be careful. So there's all of this in this involved in the laws. Everything's like like it's great. I know something. I'm going to tell people, and they're going to be really happy and appreciative of the fact that I told them they're doing the wrong thing. Not always. So that's like the Torah even puts it in when it tells you tell people they're doing the wrong thing, but don't embarrass them. Be very careful with it. We're told about the mitzvahs of shatnez. The mitzvahs of shatnez, we always think of wool and linen, but it also applies to mixtures of seeds as well.
Every fruit is like a mixture. It's a hybrid, like a.
So it's a great point. So when it comes to grafting, that's a separate avera. That's a separate issue. So, like, for example, if I have tangerines, don't have seeds. So how do you get tangerines? I guess they graft them together in order to be able to make new tangerines and things. That for a Jewish farmer may be problematic, but there's no prohibition against eating those things. So if I have plum and nectarine. That's the one, right? Nectarines are mixtures of apricots and plums, right? I think that's what it is.
Plum pots. They're called plum pots.
Oh, yes.
Plum pots. There's all these kinds of things, right? So that if you have those, there's no prohibition for a Jewish person to eat them, but that's not this week's parsha. But making them might be problematic.
Cotton candy grapes. My kid asked me this week. They're like, "What's cotton candy grapes? Is there cotton candy in it?"
That's right. They grafted the cotton candy tree together with the grape tree, and that's where it came. Then we also have the prohibitions of orla and revoy. When you plant new fruit trees, the first 3 years you're not allowed to eat any of the fruits. The 4th year you bring the fruits to Eretz Yisrael. That's mitzvahs 246, 247. This parsha. You can't be gluttonous. And interesting, there are halachos of table manners in Shulchan Aruch about how you're supposed to eat properly. We don't eat disgustingly, and we avoid seeking out signs and talking to the dead. We're not allowed to we're not allowed to shave our beards with a razor, and we're not allowed to cut our payas short, and we're not allowed to get tattoos, all listed in this week's parsha. We should keep Shabbos and revere the Beis Hamikdash. Again, the connection to the two is that when it comes to the halachos of Shabbos, the Beis Hamikdash takes priority over that. And we should respect our elders and Torah scholars. Just to finish off quickly, we'll go as quick as possible. Shishi, we have the great mitzvah of loving and protecting converts. Now, that's not listed as a separate mitzvah because it's overarching as we have love and protecting Jews in all kinds of ways. But the Torah tells us, make a very special effort when it comes to converts because they are not, they're always going to have a feeling of trying to become part of the people. And it's hard to be able to break in. Right? We always come into new groups and things to be able to fit into the environment is difficult. So we have to make that extra effort to be able to make them feel welcomed. We have to be honored. We have to be honest with our weights and measures. And then we are told again about the prohibitions of molech, sorcery. These are idolatrous practices. And we have to be able to be careful with those. Shvi, the last aliyah, to end off. We're repeated. We have a repetition of the forbidden relationships, and we are told the punishments, the capital offenses for some of them, because some of the offenses, as we said, that you get kari square. Some offenses, like adulterous relationships between a married woman, those are punishable by death sentences in court. So some of them are actually capital offenses. If you curse your parents, it's usher. We said you're not allowed to curse any Jewish person. Parents has an extra level of severity to it as well. Usually we're not allowed to curse a Jewish person. It doesn't apply to somebody who doesn't keep mitzvahs, doesn't apply to somebody who's dead. When it comes to parents, it does not matter. There are no restrictions. You can never say anything bad and curse your parents. The obligation of courts to carry out justice. You're not allowed to follow non-Jewish customs, which is very interesting because Gemara's example, for example, is that if non-Jews had a custom of wearing one color shoelaces and Jews have another custom of wearing a different color shoelaces, you can't wear the non-Jewish color. So whatever it is that the non-Jews take on as a specific practice, you can't you can't adopt that practice. Now, questions come up in halacha, like for example, let's say doctors wear lab coats. Does that mean Jews can't wear lab coats? The answer is no, because it's not being worn specifically as a non-Jewish item. But let's say, the Pope wears a special Pope hat or whatever, and the rabbi wants to wear a special Pope hat, should not wear the special Pope hat as what he does. This is a religious thing. If non-Jews steal a custom from Jews, that doesn't count. So there are lots of discussions and things that Jews do and non-Jews do. For example, bowing down on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is not a prohibition for Jews to do on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because we were doing it first. So you can't worry about things that they stole from us. Yeah. Thanksgiving is a great question, and that I could give a shir on. We'll save that one for Thanksgiving because there are arguments that's very interesting. Ramosha Feinstein, I'll just mention that Ramosha Feinstein has two different places talks about the question of Thanksgiving, and one time he says it's completely fine, don't worry about it, and one time he says it is a big problem. And it comes down to essentially that Thanksgiving, if you were in the United States, Thanksgiving was established 2 different times. One time Thanksgiving was established as a religious thanks. George Washington says that we should establish that we should establish Thanksgiving as a religious experience to thank God for what it was that He has given us, and we should go pray. And then Abraham Lincoln established Thanksgiving as a federal holiday, and it was completely secular in order to recognize the country and to give thanks for everything that we have. So essentially, we have a machlokas between George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And so,
Did you give that Thanksgiving?
yes.
Can you maybe address why it's like in the fall and not around July 4th?
Yeah, so we'll have
That's
to
confusing.
we'll have to write some of these sheer ideas down. We'll have to come back to them. But that one's a very good one. Right? And then we're finished off with the oven yidoni, which are ways that people would talk to the dead, and there's a punishment of stoning. It's not listed as a mitzvah, because we were already told earlier in the parsha, and we counted as a mitzvah not to follow them, but now we're told what the punishment is, and we have to stop here. I'm sorry, it went very long, but there's so many mitzvahs in this week's parsha. So many mitzvahs, and it's like, what is it, 80 mitzvahs in this week's parsha.
Amazing.